This is the first part in our discussion on aspects of the novel. Firstly, we need to understand what a novel is. What are we talking about? Now, you're probably going to picture a book, you're going to picture a library perhaps, and you're going to picture quite a thickish book. It is not something very short, it is usually a long narrative, in other words, a story, and it is usually fictional in nature. Might have some autobiographical elements in it, but it's usually fictional. So a longish story, which is fictional. And usually it has one main storyline. However, some novels have more than one storyline. Usually in a short story, you'll find one little aspect described and there'll be one little storyline. But in a novel, there can be more than one storyline. Now, how does this story, this narrative, how does it unfold? How do we get to hear the story? Now, the author describes certain things, right? He or she recounts a set of connected events. Obviously, the events will be connected, otherwise, it won't be one storyline. And he will recount those events. He will also suggest certain things through the thoughts and the actions of his chosen narrator. Because very often it's not the author speaking, but the author speaking through a narrator or a narrator who is a character and then has his own personality and thoughts. So through the thoughts of the narrator, we also get to know more information about other characters, about the event, etc. We will also get some information from the characters when they engage in dialogue, they speak to one another, we get to know more about the story. And another key aspect of a novel is that it is usually broken into chapters. So one main storyline, usually broken into chapters. Fine? Why do writers write novels? They usually have a very definite purpose in mind. Very often it is to entertain, it is perhaps to satirize, in other words, to mock things that are happening in society that the author or the narrator might find wrong. And it usually wants the reader to reflect on whatever is being told. And very often it is a reflection of society. We are placed within a certain setting and within a certain society, and we are meant to read it from that point of view. Fine? Now, a key concept that you need to know about novels is that it belongs to a certain genre. What is a genre? It is a category of literature, right? And there are certain things that define the genre, and those things, those criteria are stylistic. In other words, it's not about the story as such, it's stylistic things. And these stylistic criteria informs the style, the form, and then ultimately also the content. So certain genres will tend to have certain contents. Now, before you even start reading a novel, you have to establish the genre, because you need to have these set of ideas about the genre before you start reading. Otherwise, you won't really understand what you're doing or what you're reading about. And it will guide you, and it will guide your understanding. There are many different genres. There isn't only one, many different genres. You might have heard about some of these. Gothic, right? You've heard about horror, romance, we are all too familiar with those. Science fiction, young people often like to read science fiction. Crime and mystery, very popular among certain people, adventure, then there's fantasy, and then there's historical fiction, and the list goes on. Now, many different genres. But to remember one thing, and that is despite the differences in genre, they do share the same elements. I'm going to talk to you about the elements in structure, and we're going to use that as a guideline, even when later we are going to explore an actual novel to see how it's universal across genres. Now, let's just give you a few examples of genres. The literary fiction or the serious fiction will probably be the books that that's prescribed to you in school and that you will read while you're at school. It's serious literature. They are seen to have artistic value, right? And literary merit. Usually they are novels that have won Pulitzer Prizes or some kind of awards, but they will have literary merit. Very often, they are political criticisms. They comment on society. They reflect on general aspects of humanity. So they are serious works of literature. These novels are character driven. Usually there are characters that drive the action rather than plot or structure driven. They focus on the inner lives of the characters rather than external events. The characters are complex and they have multiple layers. In other words, they are round characters. And they use various styles and techniques as well as themes to bring across the message of the novel. Another genre, the family saga, also popular amongst a certain group of people, and it usually follows the lives of its characters over generations. And here you often have the story where you have layers of meanings and layers of stories, more than one storyline, and how they interact, etc. So it's about families over generations, right? They have very common plots, such as business and how the business influenced the family, property and property issues, for instance. Very often there are family curses involved, and common elements, between the various generations are explored, and sometimes there's a curse involved. It includes adventure, etc. And they tend to find a resolution in the contemporary era. In other words, anybody from whatever age group or so will be able to relate, and you can relate it to the age in which you are living. One of my favorites, Isabel Allende. She wrote some wonderful family sagas. Jeffrey Archer, Amy Tan are just a few of the authors of this genre. The dystopian genre has become quite popular. If you are young, you most probably know the Hunger Games trilogy. I know many young people like to read this. Dystopian just has to do with bad. So it is a genre of science fiction. In other words, it's part of the science fiction genre, but they are set in societies that are viewed as worse as the one that we live in right now. For that reason, they call them dystopian, right? It exists in contrast to utopian, which means like these ideal societies. It's the contrast. It's like a bad society. It's not ideal. Then there's also amongst these novels, you'll also find the young adult dystopian, mainly sort of geared towards younger readers, and The Hunger Games is a good example of that. It's by Suzanne Collins, and it's set in the Hunger Games universe. It's a trilogy, and it's about a teenage protagonist named Katniss Everdeen. Now, you must, as I said, know the genre to which the novel belongs before you start even reading it. And if I look at a novel that you are likely to read soon, or perhaps during the course of your career, it will be Life of Pi, and this is an interesting one because it belongs to various categories or various genres. So you're going to have a lot of things to look out for while you are reading Life of Pi. For instance, it belongs to the philosophical genre, postmodernist. That's mainly concerning after World War II and how the world views the new world, in other words, the world after World War II. It includes adventure and it includes magical realism. And you need to understand all these concepts when you read the novel itself, Life of Pi. For instance, magical realism means that hyper-realistic elements are used, where several fantastic elements are used to take the story out of reality. For instance, the carnivorous island. You actually know that it cannot exist. The unseen Frenchman. You know that he cannot really exist. The fact that you survive for 227 days on a tiny lifeboat and your partner is a Bengal tiger. So these things seem sort of hyper-realistic, fantastical in nature. However, you are told from the beginning of the novel that this is a true story. So what happens is you engage in something that is called suspended disbelief. Now, basically, that is what you do every time you go into a movie theater. And the story starts, and you see things that don't seem to be realistic, or you think, oh, no. However, what do? You set those feelings, those thoughts apart from your reality right there in the theater, and you engage in the story. You indulge in the story. You cry when you have to cry. You laugh when you have to cry. You suspend any disbelief. In other words, you believe what you see in front of you, just for that time, for the time that you're sitting in the theater. So you're told from the beginning that The Life of Pi is a true story, and you don't question the unseen Frenchman. You read about it and you take it for what it is, right? So, as I said, it functions on several levels. So while this is very fantastical, you are told that it's a true story, and at the end, some of the characters actually also bring you back to reality. For instance, Mr. Okamoto and Mr. Chiba voice the doubts of the reader. In other words, when these characters now voice the doubts that the reader might have had in his mind, it actually brings it to the fore, and it makes you question these things and ask you, why did the author use these stylistic methods? So he doubts, these two characters voice the doubts of the reader as Pi's story gets more and more fantastical, and we realize just how impossible the story is. And now we start looking for hidden meanings, etc. We go into the philosophical, we go into postmodernist, we go into adventure, and we research that, and we try to find meaning and theme for this novel. Yes, so know your genre before you start reading.